enough to continue in the footsteps of these giants of, well, even not even just humans, in the Harler, the David and Elizabeth Lack. And I went back to the Pyrenees, and for the main PhD project was 4 years of systematic insect migration monitoring in the very same pass that David and Elizabeth Lack went up to. There's one in the center, guarded by the Harler in the sky over there. What we had up there, we had a bidirectional malaise trap, which we put in the flow of the insects. It caught the insects going southwards, and then if there are any coming back north, which were far less numerous, it would catch them as well. And you might be thinking that, migratory insects were the butterflies and the monarch butterflies, etc. But in reality, it's the flies which are the best ones. They're so numerous, 90%. It's an incredible bias towards flies in the migratory assemblage. And we drilled down a bit further into the different families, and we found that, just like David and Elizabeth found, it was the hoverflies, the Surfidae, 20%. They were the most numerous, but really closely followed by the Chlorophidae, which is fascinating. The Sciarids, muscids, all of these families detailed here have been shown to be actively migrating through. They're choosing favorable winds to move through, or they're going against the wind. And we're finding basically none of them going back north, even if there's a wind that would blow them that way. They're all trying to go south. So we're pretty certain that these are all migrants. And also the pass is about 2,500 meters up, and so it's completely barren in the Pyrenees, so there's no food up there. So all of these insects are moving through on migration. And so, yeah, it's wonderful to be up there to see how these even tiny, minuscule insects migrate, like this Scava selenistica hoverfly, and also this little grassfly, a little Ocinella species, just unbelievably small, moving through. And we also counted a lot. This is a video file from one of our camera traps, and this took ages because we counted these more or less one by one, and then scaled it up to it recorded for a minute every 15 minutes throughout the day, and then we scaled it up to the full size, and the numbers were amazing. So remember, this pass is only 30 meters wide. We recorded 68 million insects across the 4 years, 17 million on average per year. And on one day, the peak rate was 3,678 insects per meter per minute, which is unbelievable. And I also, it's not in this talk, but I went to Cyprus, and the peak rate of the insects coming across the sea from the Middle East, 105 kilometers of open water, was just over 6,000 insects per meter per minute. And these were Aristalis tenax in big numbers, but also lots of Stomoxys flies. And I just traveled so far and was so hungry, and we were just getting eaten to death by these little flies. Anyway, let's talk about fly migration in general. I'm currently have a review under review of fly migration, and going through the literature, we think that 60 out of 130 or so fly families have migratory species within their ranks. And currently there's been 625 flies identified as migratory, but as you all know, this is an incredibly small number for the number of fly species. So there's a lot more work to do to find out what's happening, which shows how important taxonomy is. Okay, why do flies migrate? Well, more or less, it can be surmised flies migrate to have more sex. They will migrate to exploit seasonal habitats where they have enough food and resources to reproduce. And this allows these flies to breed all year round. They don't hibernate over the winter. They don't go over winter as an egg. Throughout the entire year, they can create more flies. And this is really important because they fly so far, and so they have a lot of dangers on the way. And so they have a really high reproductive output compared to sedentary species. Fly migration is not like bird migration. Imagine you're a swift or a swallow. You go from the north of from the northern reaches up here in the UK, for example, and then fly all the way down south and then all the way back up again as a single individual. Whereas if you put yourselves in the 6 tiny shoes of a migratory hoverfly, then you'll be migrating downwards in one huge journey, 1,000 or more kilometers long, and then you will die off. You'll lay your eggs and then you'll die off. And fascinatingly, we think it's only the females which are making these huge journeys. In the Pyrenees, we're seeing maybe 80 to 90% of the marmalade hoverflies coming through are female, which is really fascinating. We think they're storing the sperm and flying the huge distances, and then they lay their eggs, and then the next generation have males and females to mate with. And then in the springtime, coming back north, it's a series of multi-generational hops until they reach the zenith, and then there's a sedentary period where a generation's quite lazy and stays in one place. But if you think about it, this is really remarkable, because once a fly gets into an area, she finds somewhere to lay her eggs, and then she lays her eggs, and then she'll die off, leaving her children to continue the migratory journey with never meeting their parents and not having any experienced individuals to follow. And so their entire migratory information is passed on genetically. And the genetics is really fascinating, because so Toby Doyle, one of my lab mates, did this fascinating work where a hoverfly larva, a lot of the work on migrants has been done on hoverflies, which is why I'm talking about it, but it probably occurs throughout the taxa. It will spend its third instar just looking up at the sky, taking in temperature information, day length, etc. And then it will undergo this incredible genetic changes if it thinks that, okay, it's time to migrate. And we found that 1,500 genes are expressed differentially compared to a sedentary generation and a migratory one. And these include things like improved metabolism, better, stronger muscles, increased immunity. These hoverflies are less stressed than their sedentary generations. They live longer and they have better eyes and smell and all these things. And just to be so completely different to your forebearers is amazing, because they're bigger and stronger. It's such a huge feat to be a migratory fly. And there's a very brief plug on a very recent paper we've just had published. We found, or Richard Massey found that migratory individuals compared to non-migratory individuals fly further, but they don't fly any faster than the non-migrants. Okay, how do they migrate? Well, Richard again found this amazing thing that these flies are using the sun as a compass, but this is really fascinating because the flies move across the sky during the day. And or can I go into the story? Yeah, I can go into the story. Okay, what he did is he caught loads of Scava pyrastri in the Pyrenees, and he flew them on a flight simulator, which is basically you glue them to the end of a pin, put them on a magnet, and look up at them with a camera, and they can spin in 360 degrees but not go anywhere. And when you catch them, they all want to fly southwards. And then he took them into the house we were staying, and he made this light-proof box, and he shifted their daylight hours by 6 hours. And this took about 10 days. And then after the 10 days, he got them out and he flew them again, and all the flies had shifted their direction 90 degrees, irrelevant in comparison to the sun. And this showed that they've got this amazing little clock in their brains. And then they'll reset again when the sun is in the right place. And so, they're just really quite amazing. Okay, and also, they're really good at choosing favorable winds because they're so small. They can't fly really fast, and so they instead utilize the power of the winds. And I was on the Ars of Scilly, and we just caught a lot of hoverflies coming in, and we backtracked their trajectories, and we think that they managed to get from northern Spain, southern France, which is 500 kilometers or so, in about 5, 6, 7 hours on strong winds. They're incredible little animals. Yes, Boyer showed that they're able to choose favorable winds. Okay, where do they fly? So this map is all the little pink dots are all the fly migration research places or studies performed in the world. And then the arrows are where we have rough evidence for fly migratory pathways. And fly migration has been found from 7 continents in the world, including Antarctica, because there's, I mean, whether it's migration or not, but it's certainly long distance flights. Down here on Marion Island, that little red dot is in Antarctic waters, and they found these Calophora chrysopalpis blowflies arriving there, and it's so far. And there's so much to discover. It's unbelievable. You can see actually there's a dot right in the middle of the southern Atlantic Ocean where they've been finding Aristalis 10x flies. Oh, so cool. I really want to get on a boat because my friend Dan is off the coast of Borneo and he keeps seeing tabanis, horseflies, just coming in like hundreds of kilometers off the coast. There's so much to know. Anyway, where are we going to go? Okay, the longest known fly migration was figured out using isotopes. And if we're talking about isotopes, let's talk about deuterium, which is a type of hydrogen isotope. And deuterium varies, the amount of it in the soil varies with the amount of rainfall. And so you can kind of map it on a map. And the plants will take up this specific ratio of water. And then aphids will eat the plants, taking up the same ratio. And then hoverflies will eat the aphids. And then the deuterium ratio is stored in their wings. They take the water of home with them wherever they fly. And this means that you can catch hoverflies or any insect anywhere in the world. And if there's been good maps made, you can work out where they were born. And this is exactly what Scott Clem did in 2023. He looked at Eupieres americanus, and he was in Alabama, and he caught lots of these little flies and mushed them up and looked at their deuterium isotopes. And he found that they were flying 3,000 kilometers, or a few were flying 3,000 kilometers from Canada. And this is just to mid-eastern America, right? They're probably going even further. So this is just on their journey, and these flies have already made it 3,000 kilometers in the time period. There are loads of different fly stories, from the ones which might be crossing the Saharan desert. There's been ones found moving through the Thorong La Pass, 5,000 meters up in the Himalayas. But there's also so much we don't know. And I had the incredible luck to go to the Maldives last year to help look at dragonfly migration. And the dragonflies are amazing. So I went with Johanna Headland, who wrote this paper, and these dragonflies fly from India to Africa in about 4 days, a 3,000 kilometer plus oceanic crossing, where they're using winds about a kilometer up to fly really fast. And some of them go over the Maldives, and they arrive in great numbers. And here's a globe skimmer that we caught that we think had just arrived from India, because there was nothing east of us. And looking closely at her wings, you can see that there's 4 or maybe 5 little tiny flies on there, these Forcipamia species, Ceratopogonidae, which are feeding on the hemolymph of the dragonfly's wing veins. And they might have flown all the way from India. We don't know. We collected this dragonfly, and so all the dragonflies we caught had these flies on them. And so hopefully we'll do some isotopic research, which will come out at some point. I actually don't know the results. I would share them, but I don't know. And these little dragon riders coming along for the ride with their in-flight meals and all these little connectivities. So amazing. So much more to be discovered. And I love this next study, because this reindeer warblefly, which is perhaps the best looking fly. They lay their eggs in reindeer, and somebody, Nielsen and Anderson, they put one on a flight mill, and it just flew. It flew for 12 hours continuously and carried on flying with stops and starts for about 36 hours. And why would it need to do this? This was a female as well. It wasn't a male that was just buzzing around hilltops all the time. So what if they're following the reindeer on migration? Because they'll come out as they've had the gruesome tale of going in through the reindeer's nose and then dropping out on the floor and pupating. Then they've like lost the reindeer. Maybe they then fly after the reindeer and find new ones. So exciting. Okay, nearing the end. Ecological roles. Flies are amazing. I don't think there's any other group of animals that have such diverse ecological roles. Like they can just do everything. So all of them are nutrient vectors. They're transporting nutrients around the world. 62% of the flies that we've been looking at in the review are pollinators. In fact, this number increased to almost 98% when we looked at the ones going through the Pyrenees. 35% decomposers, 18% pests, 16% disease vectors, and a lot of them are really good pest controllers. In fact, this gave a Selenitica here done by my friend Teddy, who does incredible drawings. I thoroughly recommend following him on Instagram. What was it? It was Episurfus bultiatus and Eupiodes corollae. They had a study showing that the number arriving in the UK will eat, I think it was between 10 and 20 trillion aphids as they arrive. And this is about 20% of the early spring aphid population. And so these things are incredibly important for protecting our crops. Pollination is perhaps the most interesting. I mean, bees are great, right? But they're not as good as flies. And because they fly such great distances, and so they can link geographically isolated plant populations, which crucially allows gene flow. Because if you're a bee and you're moving 500 meters, then you're always pollinating the same thing with the same genes. And eventually this could lead to inbreeding for the plants. But if you're a fly, you've just moved pollen from maybe 500 kilometers away to that same species. And yes, this increases plant health, population health, but also it can move genes around, and genes that, if it's a more southerly population, that plant population might be well adapted to dealing with drought, for example. And so in this climate crisis, which is happening really quickly, these flies might be moving genes for dealing with things like drought further north into plant populations which perhaps haven't evolved these genes fast enough, and they're helping to protect against climate change. So cool. Okay, decomposers. This is a Musca domestica, and incredibly, 50 female Musca domesticas can produce enough larvae to decompose an upper limit of 444 kilos, which is very specific, but nearly half a ton of cow slurry. And that's about 25,000 larvae from 50 females. And we recorded through the Pyrenees 1.2 million of Musca autumnalis, a slightly different species, but with similar life histories, females migrating through the Pyrenees every year. And this is just through a 30-meter wide pass, remember, so there's way bigger, these numbers. And if you do the maths, and obviously this is under completely perfect conditions, expecting every single one of these hot flies to lay all of her eggs in this giant vat of cow manure. But if they did do that, then 13,000 tons of cow shit would be decomposed, which is unbelievable. Yeah, flies are great. Okay. Nutrient vectors. Now this is really important because flies move in huge numbers. If we take the 90% rule of flies in terms of the assemblage, there's been studies using radar in just southern England that showed every year on average 3.5 trillion insects migrate overhead. So if you multiply this by the world, they're moving in probably hundreds of trillions. And they're all multi-generational. So when they get into an area they want to lay their eggs in, the adults die off. And so all the nutrients in their bodies, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, things which are really limiting to plant growth goes into the soil or the ecosystems. And this is really important for soil health. And this movement and this influx is regular and seasonal. And we don't know this yet, but it wouldn't surprise me that these plants and these ecosystems are actively relying on this seasonal regular influx of nutrients in order to survive, to bloom. So these flies could be hugely important, but we just don't know it yet. Of course, it's not just things that the flies are immediately impacting, it's also the birds are likely relying on insect migrants. Birds, of course, need insects to live. That's their main food source. And especially as it gets to later summer, migrant insects carry on becoming more and more abundant compared to more resident insects, which slowly die off towards the end of the summer, which means that migrant insects, especially flies, could be really important to bird migrants. And about 70% of the cross-Saharan migrant birds are insectivores. And so it could be that these birds are actively relying on the fly migrants in order to allow their own migration to occur. And we've seen similar things happening in moths and with bats relying on them as well. Okay, migratory flies, as we've seen, are hugely important, but they are under threat and they're declining. There's a really genuinely terrifying study from the German Alps by Wolf Gatter that showed a 97% decline in aphid-eating migratory hoverflies in the last 50 years. And we think similar things. Another long-term study I'm working on at the moment from the Alps here, that's a very similar number in terms of the migratory hoverflies. And these things are, and maybe it happens the same as in the Pyrenees as well. And declining due to climate crisis, habitat loss, extreme weather, all these things connected. But there really is a sunrise of hope, because I mean we've just seen that these little Musca domestica are laying 500 eggs per time. These insects have so many eggs, and which means that if they're given the chance, they can recover really very quickly. And that's all about, for migrants, it's about landscape connectivity. You can't have a nature reserve in Wrexham and think it will protect the rest of the world's migrants. So landscape connectivity, which is all things like wildflowers, reducing pesticides on farmland, but I think, and we can all do these things and put pressure on policy makers to help protect. But I think the most important thing is just telling everyone about how amazing these migrants are. What David Attenborough said quite recently is, what you don't know, you cannot love. And I love this, because just going out and telling primary school children, your grandmas, grandfathers, and getting them to love these insects too, realizing that a marmalade hoverfly or even a cabbage white butterfly that's just arrived in your garden might have traveled thousands of kilometers to be there, is really genuinely incredible. And so that, and eating organically, pressure on landowners and policymakers, means that we can, as a group, really protect these most remarkable migrants of all. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you to all these people, and of course to all of you for listening. Any questions?
Do we have any questions in the chat, Victoria? Yeah. Okay. Do we have questions in the room? We do have a question in the room. Oh, we've got two questions in the room. Should we go to Phil at the back first?
General question.
I reckon so. Oh, sorry. Go
I'll repeat the question for the people online. Could migration within the UK be important?
So I think so. So we really don't know how far all these flies are going. Like, we think that maybe the larger hoverflies might be going thousands of kilometers. They may even be crossing the Sahara, but a lot of them might just be moving shorter distances. And so I think within the UK, certainly there'll be movement, and yeah, surely important. Like Cornwall's going to be way better to live in over winter than the Highlands. And I think that these migrants are really plastic. They're very flexible in where they want to, where they can lay their eggs. And if there's resources, then they're laying them. They're not like really fixated on a specific point like a bird migrant would be. Roger, did you have a question?
My question, Will, is more observation with a question.
Okay.
You rightly highlight the decline in particularly aphid feeders, and that's been ever so noticeable this year. We've seen very few of many of the common aphids. And it got me thinking, what was the factor that might be that this year is exceptional? And my thinking lies in the drought and heat wave in the Med last year. We didn't have one last year in Britain. We had a nice wet year. Had a nice wet year this year. Absolutely wet. But what we ought to have seen was a bounce back.
Yeah.
And whilst we have seen some bounce back, and I've got some good evidence, I have this suspicion or its developing theory that in actual fact, a very high percentage of what is happening in Northern Europe is actually a reflection of drought in the Med. And I just wondered whether you'd actually seen anything data-wise that might support that.
So I haven't seen anything because we don't really have really long-term data sets, but I think this next year coming, we might have some answers because in the Sahara at the moment, there's been lots of floodings
Yes.
And so I'm kind of expecting next spring to be a really big year for migrants, because that's exactly what we saw in Cyprus in 2019. There was loads of rains across the Middle East, and then it was a big painted lady year, wasn't it? And lots of vagrant emperor dragonflies made it up this way, and we saw so many flies, and so I think that, yeah, perhaps. I mean, I'm certain you're right that there's a big link between them. But I wonder if this year coming we'll actually see whether these rains in the Sahara will bring more migrants.
Well, it'd be interesting to pick up migrant.
Yeah.
But what I think is also coming through for me is that we assume that most of the migrants are things like Episurfus, Skiba, UPODs. And I'm beginning to suspect that actually a much broader suite of species are involved. And so without hogging the time, what I suggest we do is we actually look at what your data show in terms of what's coming through.
Yeah.
Let's have a look at what we know about declines in aphidophagous in Britain.
Yes.
And then start to see whether we can actually highlight the possibility of actually quite a lot of these populations being supplemented by unknown as yet migrations.
I think there's so much more to know.
So let's have a chat later on.
Let's do it. Yeah, taxonomy is so important in migration. Yeah.
All right. We should probably.
You can talk to me in the break.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm afraid we probably ought to move on, but thank you very much, Will. That was a really interesting, great talk. Thank you.